Good evening. I want to welcome everyone to this first lecture in a lecture series that has been sponsored by one of our alumni, Pukraj Jain, who is a 1965 B.Tech from Mechanical Engineering, from B.Tech Metallurgy. I just want to read out his message that he has sent since he could not be here today. This grant was given to honor people who made a difference in our lives. Under Professor B.R. Gupto's leadership, teachers and staff built this institution. We all want to remember their leadership based on principles, heart full of compassion and selfless service that was needed for the success of this now great institution. Hence, this alumnus has instituted a Professor Gupto Leadership Lecture Series. And we are very happy and proud that Professor E.G. Ramachandran is our inaugural speaker in this series. We want to welcome Professor Ramachandran here with his family. Professor Ramachandran was born in Bangalore in 1925. He obtained his BSc degree in 1943 and MSc in physics in 1944. He then became a research scholar under Professor Sir C.V. Raman. In 1945, he joined the University of Sheffield and obtained his doctorate in metallurgy in 1947 in a record time. After serving the Department of Metallurgy at the then Tata Institute, now IISc Bangalore, as a faculty member for 9 years, and National Metallurgical Laboratory, Jamshedpur, as assistant director for 5 years. He was invited to IIT Madras in 1961 as the first professor and head of the Department of Metallurgical Engineering. He was also director in charge of IIT Madras for a brief period. Professor Ramachandran was a visiting professor in Germany in 1968 and in 1977 as an invitee of DART, and in the United Kingdom during 1973 to 74 as a fellow of the Nuffield Foundation. Professor Ramachandran has dedicated himself to teaching, research, and development programs in metallurgy in the country right from 1947. During his long years of service to the metallurgical profession, he has received many honors, including the presidentship of the Indian Institute of Metals in 1980-81. He has been an active sportsman. He has excelled in tennis, and he and his wife are avid listeners of South Indian classical music. We are very pleased to have Dr. Ramachandran here with us, and I invite him to deliver the inaugural talk in this lecture series. Dr. Ramachandran.
Good evening to everybody here. I am extremely happy to give the first Professor Sen Gupta Leadership Lecture Series. This series of lectures is due to the generosity and imagination of Sri Pukraj Jain, who was a student in the very early years of the IIT and was a student of the metallurgy department in the years 1961 to 65, when I was its head. He requested me to deliver the first lecture on leadership and suggested that I talk about Professor Sen Gupta, the first director of IIT Madras, and his outstanding leadership and pioneering efforts to build the IIT Madras. I first acknowledge the help I have received in the preparation of the photographs for this lecture. I am particularly indebted to Dr. O. Prabhakar, formerly professor in the metallurgy department. Also to Professor Kamraj, its present head, Professor B.S. Murthy, and Professor Kolar, who has allowed free use of some of the archival photos of the IIT. Without their help, I would not have been able to make this presentation. I wish to thank Sri Suresh of the Alumni Office for all his help and Dr. Bhaskar Ramamurthy for his gracious presence. I first want to project a photograph of Pukraj Jain, who was a student in the IIT in 1961 to 65. And he has settled down in Springfield, Illinois. He worked in the IBM. He went to the University of Illinois from being a student here, and later on he worked with IBM. He retired from IBM, and he is now spending his years in active retired life, whatever it might mean. Professor Sengupta was the first director of IIT Madras, and here is a picture of Professor Sengupta taken in academic robes as at the one of the convocations of the institute. From a painting, I have taken this picture and projected it here. He was the first director of IIT Madras from 1959 to 1967. He was a visionary and led a dedicated team of workers, academic and non-academic, in the building of one of India's foremost educational and technological centers. I had the privilege of working with him since 1961, and I'm probably the oldest of his surviving senior collaborators. I propose to deal briefly with his leadership and contribution in several areas like buildings, admission of students, recruitment of staff, emphasis on development of practical skills, general amenities in the campus, cultural and relaxation efforts. In each of these areas, he assumed and played the direct role of leader. I am happy to see here Mr. Natarajan, who was the first registrar of the institute from 1961 to 1965 and was in no small measure responsible for the early developments in the institute. I have not particularly made a mention of Mr. Natarajan in my speech, but I am happy to acknowledge his presence and his contributions to the building of IIT Madras. In regard to buildings, Professor Sengupta decided on functional rather than artistic lines. This was so not only for the various departmental buildings, but also to the students' hostels and staff quarters. Perhaps the staff quarters in IIT Delhi appeared more artistic and comfortable, but more buildings for the same money were built at IIT Madras. The civil engineering department building was the first to be completed. Here's a picture of Dr. Mudaliar, the first chairman of the Board of Governors of the IIT with Professor Sengupta. This is the civil engineering building, which was the first to be constructed, and I will say a few words about this building. The civil engineering building was the first to be completed. The director's office, the Senate, even the library were located in this building. The metallurgy department functioned from 2 rooms in the first floor. The lectures for the students of the various branches were held in different rooms of the building. The buildings for the other departments were similar to the civil engineering building. The buildings for the other departments were similar to the civil. I believe each bay, if I remember right, was 33 feet by 10 feet and was the unit for construction. The partition walls could be easily demolished and rebuilt according to special needs. The hostels were also of standardized design. Could I have a photo of one of the hostels? This was one of the hostels, and I believe this was Krishna Hostel, and the other hostels were somewhat smaller but similar in design. The hostels were also of standardized design and purely functional. The same could also be said about the staff quarters, which were built between the principal roads, Daly Avenue and Bonn Avenue, so named because of the collaboration between India and Germany in the building of IIT Madras. The 2 avenues met at Gajendra Circle. I have made a copy from the archival photos, and I apologize for the lack of quality or clarity in these pictures, but they were the best that could be obtained. One of the outstanding structures was the open-air theatre. A natural hollow in the grounds was utilized, and a theatre was built with a magnificent stage and with a seating capacity about 8,000. This is the open-air theatre. The first few convocations were held in the open-air theatre with all the Senate and distinguished VIP people on the stage. Here's a picture of the first convocation delivered by Dr. Radhakrishnan and presided over by the Governor of Madras, the then Governor of Madras, Jaichamaraj Odiyar. Professor Sen Gupta is on the right of Jaichamaraj Odiyar. Regular film shows were held in the OAT, the student members sitting on the concrete benches and the staff members with their families in the well of the OAT. Professor Sen Gupta was fully involved in the admission of students who were admitted after a personal interview. This was not so much an issue in later years after the JEE came into existence, but in the early years, and especially for admissions to the 3-year BTech courses, interviews were an important part of the admission process. Professor Sen Gupta was a direct participant and with amazing energy and patience would personally question every candidate. He was fond of asking questions about the practical knowledge and aptitude of the students. For example, he would ask how a puncture in a cycle tube would be repaired. He expected a step-by-step reply from the candidate. He adopted the same approach for the recruitment of the academic and technical staff. The selection committees of the early days were truly formidable ones. Later, this number was reduced. In many committees, the registrar and sometimes even his assistants were present ostensibly to keep notes. Professor Sen Gupta had a great belief in the necessity of practical skills in every engineering graduate. In this, he was greatly supported by his German counterpart, Dr. Krauss, and one of the finest facilities anywhere in the world for realizing this goal came to existence in IIT Madras. For the first 2 years of the 5-year BTech course, every student had to undergo rigorous training in engineering drawing and workshop practice. The latter consisted of acquiring proficiency in fitting, lathe work, metal casting, and welding. Every student, including girl students, had compulsorily to undergo these courses and take examinations at the end of the courses. Here is a photograph of the boy students. The previous one was for the girls too. Yes, here was the girl students doing some training in turning. There was one final examination at the end of the academic year, besides 5 periodical tests during the year. The latter were supposed to be unannounced. A pass in every subject was mandatory for a student to advance to the next academic year. There have been instances of students having to repeat an entire year when they failed to pass in even one subject. It was not until his retirement and a new director at the helm that the semester system was introduced, with carryover of subjects in which one had not passed permitted. Professor Sengupta introduced a regular bus service inside the campus to meet the needs of staff and students. The distance between the hostels and the main entrance to the campus is about 3 kilometers, and the buses provided a great relief to the commuters. They used to ply up to IAR until a punitive motor vehicle tax levied by the Tamil Nadu government forced the IIT to restrict the service to within the campus. A decision which caused a lot of amusement and even some derision was in the names given to these buses: Everest, Nanda Devi, Kanchanajunga, etc., which are immovable. To balance this, the hostels were named after the flowing rivers Ganga, Narmada, Kaveri, etc. A staff club was established to meet the recreational needs of the staff. Its premises under a huge water tank were, however, overshadowed by the premises of the ladies' club, which was established by Mrs. Sengupta, who was a truly dynamic person. She actively persuaded spouses of the staff members to enroll themselves as members. Yeah, this one. Don't think you could recognize any of the ladies here. Yeah, that is my wife in the second row, fourth from right. She is standing there. A very beautiful temple dedicated to Lord Jalakanteshwarar and Devi Katyayani was also built. It is the hub of activity for the religious and spiritually minded residents of the campus and neighborhood. It's an island of peace and tranquility and is hugely crowded on all the important religious festival days. Arranging for deduction of the monthly subscription from the staff salaries has ensured a steady and reliable income for the temple. No account of Professor Sengupta's efforts in building the IIT Madras would be complete without a special mention of his love for the natural habitat and his efforts to preserve the same. The vegetation was more dense and profuse in the early years of the IIT than what it is today. Deer and monkeys, not to mention snakes, were encountered often. Here is a picture of some monkeys and of deer. The deer were timid to begin with, but got accustomed to the human presence and movements and became quite bold. They would often raid the gardens inside the various quarters, jumping over the fencing border. Monkeys were quite a menace. They would, in a group, raid some flats, frightening the occupants and make away with whatever they could find. Professor Sengupta was very strict about protecting the fauna and flora in the campus. There was a strict prohibition on the cutting of trees, and this special permission had to be obtained to cut or even trim a tree even in one's own compound. There is no doubt that the campus looked far greener and more wooded and more beautiful than it is at present. No attempt is made to refer to the many developments made after Professor Sengupta's retirement from the IIT. I have tried to give an account, principally from memory, of many of the developments made by him, which emphasize his leadership and skills and achievements. In conclusion, I wish to repeat what I said in an obituary note I wrote on Professor Sengupta. The inscription on the tomb of Sir Christopher Wren, who designed, built, and was buried in St. Paul's Cathedral in London, says that if you want to see his contribution, look around you. A similar thing can be said about Professor Sengupta. If you want to see his contribution to future generations, look around the campus. Thank you very much indeed.
Let's thank Dr. Ramachandran again for his wonderful talk. And I will request our director, Professor Bhaskar Ramurthy, to hand him a small memento. So very appropriately, this memento is actually a gold-plated leaf from our campus made by one of our metallurgy alumni, Mr. D. Chandrasekhar, who is one of our distinguished alumni. So the floor is now open for any reminiscences about Professor Sengupta. If anybody in the audience would like to say something that they want to add to Dr. Ramachandran's reflections. Yes.
Good evening. This is Muthukrishnan, 72 batch of metallurgy. Dr. EGR has said very aptly, there were 6 guys who repeated for the loss of 5 marks in English, 6 in metallurgy. And the periodicals that is announced the previous evening was a deadly thing. And that is one part of it. The second part is, till you finish the 5 periodicals, you are ever ready for your final exam. Only the last little bit you have to revise and things like that. This is what I wanted to tell. 6 people repeating one full year for the lack of 5 marks in English. All of them are today in deadly positions.
Mr. Natarajan, do you want to add some remarks?
Ramurthy and friends. It's a real privilege and pleasure to associate myself with a function like this. Singer Barbara once sang that it is very difficult to speak without emotion about a person with whom you have had such a close and mutual association. Barbara sang, I cannot sing the old songs that I sang, for heart and voice would fail me and foolish tears will flow. I received Professor Sengupta, having joined the IIT in July 1959. And from that moment onwards, there was a very affectionate association between Professor Sen Gupto and myself. My wife was a close friend of Mrs. Shanti Sen Gupto, and it was a privilege, it was a wooded existence that we had there. It was a cool cathedral of greenery, as novelist Narayanan would have written. There was no need for worry at all here for anybody. But who will worry in such wooded bliss? Of course, Professor Sen Gupta made things a little difficult for students. He did some unpredictable steps, like sudden examinations, which gave blood pressure to even people of 16 and above. There were a lot of protests against it, but Professor Sen Gupta stuck to it.
Can you come here and?
And so these tests tested their skills and preparedness for anything. And Professor Sen Gupta lost some popularity with the students for some time because of these examinations. But later, the students themselves understood that it was for their good. And then everything was plain sailing. I had the privilege of naming the Gajendra Circle. And I had the privilege of naming the 3 avenues too. Madras Avenue, Bonn Avenue, and Delhi Avenue. And Professor Sen Gupta agreed with me. He first asked me the rationale of doing it. I told him, the IIT Madras is a tale of 3 cities, Bonn, Delhi, and Madras, outbeating Charles Dickens, the tale of 2 cities. And that was the reason for having the 3 avenues. And I also had the privilege of naming the hostels after rivers and the buses after mountains. In fact, at a function which was presided over by the former President Dwight Eisenhower's grandson, he said, the IIT Madras is the only place where you have moving mountains and stationary rivers. Kanchenjunga, Everest, were all those moving buses. And Krishna, Narmada, Godavari, Mandakini were all stationary rivers. Glorious were those days to be associated with it. And I can tell you, I retired as Chief Secretary to government in 1987. But those 6.5 years that I was associated with the IIT, I remember that as the most golden of my entire service of 37 years. Second, of course, I became a member of the Board of Revenue and became Relief Commissioner and wrote up the flood manual, which is still being followed to tackle natural calamities. And then as a Chief Secretary to government, that was a different story because you had to suddenly meet with situations as they arose. But believe me, nothing can ever come even a distant second to my association with the IIT Madras and particularly Professor Vibhuti Bhushan Sen Gupta. Thank you.
While we're talking about Professor Sen Gupta's strictness, there was a solace. You can always walk into Professor Sambat, Deputy Director, get some advice and relief.